There is a process unfolding right now that most people will never see, even though they feel its weight every single day. It does not use weapons, and it does not fight for territory. This is the invisible war for human consciousness, a systematic shaping of belief that begins long before you realize it and decides the direction of your life before you even have the chance to question it. What you are looking at on the surface is not the true battlefield. The events that dominate attention, the conflicts that appear in public view, the systems people argue over, all of it exists at a level that is easier to see, but not where the real process is taking place. The deeper layer operates quietly, within the mind itself, where perception forms and meaning is assigned before anything is understood consciously. There have always been individuals who understood this, not in a vague or symbolic way, but in a precise and practical sense. They studied how human beings think, how belief takes hold, how attention can be guided, and how emotion can be triggered in ways that influence behavior without the need for force. They recognized that once you understand the structure of the mind, control no longer needs to be direct. It becomes subtle. It becomes internal. Because if you can shape how a person sees the world, you do not need to control the world they are in. This is where the idea of power begins to shift. Most people look at visible authority and assume that is where control exists. Governments, institutions, systems that organize society. But these operate within a shared perception that has already been accepted. And that perception is where the real influence lies. Because once a certain way of seeing becomes normal, everything built on top of it feels natural and unquestionable. The objective is not simply domination in a physical sense. It is the shaping of belief over time. It is the quiet construction of what people accept as real, what they focus on, and what they ignore without ever realizing it. Because once belief is shaped, behavior follows. There is no need to force action. People begin to move in alignment with what they believe is true. This process is not distant. It is not hidden somewhere outside of your experience. It is happening within it, constantly, in ways that are easy to overlook. Think about how quickly your mind assigns meaning to something. A message, a tone of voice, a situation. Before you pause, before you examine it, your mind has already decided what it means. That interpretation feels immediate. It feels real, but it is not neutral. It has been shaped by patterns that have been repeated over time. Two people can experience the same moment and walk away with completely different conclusions. One sees rejection. The other sees feedback. One feels limited. The other feels redirected. The situation itself has not changed, but the meaning assigned to it has. And that meaning shapes everything that follows. It shapes emotion. It shapes behavior. And it shapes the direction that person moves in next. This is where attention becomes a powerful factor. What you focus on does not simply pass through your awareness. It builds. It accumulates. It begins to define what stands out and what disappears. If your attention is constantly drawn toward fear, conflict, and instability, then your experience of the world will begin to reflect those patterns. Not because that is all that exists, but because that is what you are repeatedly seeing. At the same time, if your attention is directed toward understanding, toward patterns, toward what can be done instead of what cannot, then a different experience begins to form. The external world may remain the same, but your perception of it changes. And that change in perception leads to different decisions, different actions, and eventually different outcomes. Emotion strengthens this entire process. It gives weight to what is being perceived. It makes certain interpretations feel urgent and undeniable. When something triggers fear, it feels real. When something triggers anger, it feels justified. And once something feels real, it begins to guide behavior without being questioned. This is why repetition matters. The same ideas, the same emotional signals, the same narratives repeated over time begin to feel familiar, and familiarity becomes belief. Once belief is formed, it does not need to be reinforced in an obvious way. It maintains itself. A person begins to think within a certain range without realizing that the range itself has been shaped. This is how influence becomes invisible. It no longer feels external. It feels internal. It feels like your own thoughts, your own conclusions, your own perspective. And that is what makes it so effective. Because once something feels like it comes from you, it is rarely questioned. But if you slow down and observe carefully, you begin to notice something that changes everything. There is always a moment before interpretation settles, a moment where a situation is still open, where more than one meaning is possible. That moment is brief, and it is often missed, but it exists, and in that moment, perception has not yet been fixed. This is where awareness begins, because the more you notice that moment, the more you begin to see how quickly it closes, how fast a familiar pattern takes over, how easily a conclusion forms without being examined. And once you see that happening, even once, something shifts. You begin to create space. Instead of reacting immediately, you pause. You observe what is happening within your own mind. You notice the thought as it appears. You recognize the emotion as it builds. And in that space, something important happens. You are no longer completely inside the process. You are observing it, and that changes everything. Because the moment you begin to see how your perception is being shaped, you are no longer fully carried by it. You begin to question what feels obvious. You begin to recognize patterns that were previously invisible. You begin to see how your attention is being directed, how your reactions are being influenced, and how your experience is being constructed over time. And that is where the deeper process starts to become visible. Once you begin to see that your perception is being shaped, the next question becomes difficult to ignore. If this process is happening within you, then it is not random. It follows patterns. And if it follows patterns, it can be understood. The same way habits are formed, the same way beliefs are reinforced, perception itself becomes something that develops over time through repetition, attention, and emotional reinforcement. This is where the idea of a spiritual endgame becomes clearer, not as something distant or abstract, but as something that plays out through ordinary human behavior. Because what is being shaped is not just what people think, but the range of what they believe is possible. And once that range is defined, most people live within it without ever questioning where it came from. You can see this in everyday life. A person begins to believe that they are limited in some way. That belief does not stay as a simple thought. It begins to shape what they notice. They start to see evidence that confirms it. They remember the times things did not work out. They pay attention to situations that reinforce the idea. Over time, their attention filters out anything that contradicts that belief. What remains becomes their reality. Now, consider the same process in a different direction. A person begins to believe that there is always a way forward, even if it is not immediately visible. That belief changes what they focus on. They begin to notice patterns, opportunities, and connections that were previously ignored. Their behavior shifts. They take action where they might have hesitated before. And over time, their results begin to reflect that shift. In both cases, the external world has not fundamentally changed. What has changed is the internal lens through which it is being experienced. This is why belief is so powerful. Because belief does not just influence what you think, it influences what you see, and what you see determines how you act. Once belief is shaped, the rest of the process begins to unfold naturally. This is also why most people do not recognize what is happening. They assume their perception is direct. They assume what they see is simply what is there. But what they are experiencing is already filtered, already interpreted, already shaped by patterns that have been reinforced over time. And this is where the process becomes stable. It does not require constant control. It does not require force. It sustains itself through repetition and familiarity. Once something feels familiar, it feels true. And once it feels true, it is rarely questioned. This is how the boundaries of thought are set. Not by removing options directly, but by making certain options invisible. If something is never considered, it is as if it does not exist. If a perspective is never explored, it never becomes part of the decision-making process. Over time, this creates a narrow range of what feels possible, and within that range, people operate freely, without realizing that the range itself has been shaped. This is what makes the process so effective. It does not remove freedom. It defines it. It determines what freedom looks like, what it includes, and what it excludes. And once that definition is accepted, everything else follows from it. You can see this in the way people respond to uncertainty. When something unfamiliar appears, most reactions are immediate. Fear, hesitation, resistance. Not because the situation is fully understood, but because it falls outside of what feels known and accepted. That reaction feels natural, but it is shaped by what has been reinforced over time. The same applies to opportunity. If something does not fit within a person's current belief system, it is often ignored or dismissed. Not because it lacks value, but because it does not align with what they have come to see as possible. This is how perception quietly shapes direction, and this is where the modern environment plays a role. Attention is constantly being pulled in different directions. There is always something to react to, something to focus on, something that demands immediate engagement. When attention is constantly moving, it does not settle. And when it does not settle, it does not observe itself. Without observation, the process remains invisible. A person continues to react, to interpret, to reinforce patterns without ever seeing how those patterns are being formed. And over time, those patterns become the foundation of how reality is experienced. But the moment attention slows down, even briefly, something becomes noticeable. When there is no immediate input, when there is no distraction, when there is no constant stream of information, the mind begins to reveal its patterns more clearly. Thoughts become easier to observe. Reactions become easier to recognize. The process that was once automatic begins to come into view. This is where the shift begins, because once you can see the process, you are no longer completely inside it. You begin to recognize that not every thought needs to be accepted. Not every reaction needs to be followed. Not every interpretation needs to define your experience. There is a gap between what happens and how it is understood. And in that gap, there is choice. This is where the idea of control changes again. It is no longer about controlling the external world, and it is not about resisting everything that influences you. It is about understanding the process well enough to engage with it consciously. You begin to choose what you focus on. you begin to filter what you allow into your attention. You begin to question what feels obvious, and over time, this creates a different relationship with reality. You are still in the same world, but you are no longer experiencing it in the same way. This is where the deeper meaning of the war for consciousness becomes personal. It is not something that exists somewhere else. It is something that happens within your own experience, in every moment where perception forms, where interpretation settles, and where belief is reinforced. And in that sense, the outcome is not determined only by external forces. It is shaped through awareness, because the moment you begin to see how your perception is being formed, even slightly, the process begins to loosen. You are no longer moving entirely on automatic patterns. You are no longer accepting every interpretation without question. You are participating in the process, and that changes everything. Because the war was never about controlling the world alone. It has always been about shaping how the world is experienced. And once you understand that, the question is no longer who is in control. The question becomes whether you are aware of what is shaping your perception, because that is where everything begins, and that is where everything changes.